Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to my channel, Taylor Does Whatever, where we pretty much do anything from true crime to talking about life, talking about makeup, pretty much anything that my scatterbrain wants to talk about for the day. So today's video, I thought that I would bring you guys a true crime video. You guys seem to really enjoy listening to the stories of the true crimes that I talk about. So without further ado, let's just jump into today's video. So as of right now, this case is considered to be an unsolved case. However, a lot of people definitely have their suspicions, but unfortunately the case has not been brought to justice. So today's case is going to be about a man named Brian Egg. And Brian Egg was a 65-year-old man who lived in San Francisco, California. He lived in the same house since the 70s. He was really well known around the neighborhood. He was very well known around the neighborhood to always be gardening in his garden. He loved to show people his garden. He loved to talk to people around the neighborhood, get to know different people. He was always walking his little white fluffy dog, and he just was overall known to be a really well-liked person. Brian didn't have a job for quite a while. His last pretty well-known job was around the 80s when he actually worked at a really well-known bar club in San Francisco called The Stud, and it was actually a gay bar that was really common around the area. San Francisco, for those of you guys who might not know, was a huge pioneer in the LGBTQ rights. So that's where he worked. He was pretty known for working in that bar. But as of the most recent years, Brian had no job and no main source of income as far as work goes. So Brian lived in San Francisco, but he did buy his house in the 70s. So houses back then, especially in San Francisco, were nowhere near the cost that they are today. So his house that he purchased long ago was worth like $20,000, but now it's actually worth over $1 million just because of the location where it is. So basically a little bit about the location that he lived in. It's a huge rise of affluent people. I mean, we all know that about San Francisco. There's a lot of money in the area. But unfortunately, along with the high amounts of money that are in that area, there's also a really large homeless population that's in the area. It was actually pretty known for Brian to go to different types of homeless shelters or places that served meals for homeless people. He was often known to actually eat in those areas as well. But neighbors had a lot to say about Brian being a very kind-hearted man, and sometimes he was almost too kind to the point where people tend to take advantage of you. I know people in my life who are like that, but some people who are just so friendly and try to give to so many people, and a lot of people kind of latch on to people who are like that, and that was the type of person that he was. Neighbors would say that they've seen, him open his doors to pretty much anyone who needed help. So whether he met them, at homeless shelters, or if it was just someone who, again, needed a place to stay, Brian was typically opening the doors for anybody. But unfortunately, that did lead to a lot of people who would take advantage of him. So basically around the end of May, kind of early June, Scott Free, who was actually the neighbor to Brian, noticed that he hadn't seen Brian in a while. Brian was normally always out in his garden. He was conversing with people, he was walking his dog on a daily basis, but he did notice that around June, he wasn't seeing Brian as much as he normally was. So right off the bat, that kind of sparked some concern for Scott. He's been his neighbor for around 30 years, so by then I feel like you kind of have an understanding of the behaviors and the patterns of the people that you're living around. So Scott's concern really started to kind of grow around where Brian is, because he started noticing two men in particular who were going in and out of the house, who were clearly staying at Brian's house, and he saw them a lot, but he didn't see Brian often. So right off the bat, that kind of started really giving him red flag warnings. So Free decided to actually reach out to the police. He was just like, hey, something's clearly not right. So in July is when Free really started to grow suspicious and actually did call the authorities then for the first time, because these men who were going in and out of Brian's house were claiming that Brian was on vacation and they were basically staying at his house, watching his house while Brian was out on vacation. And this just seemed a little unusual. So that's when Scott decided to actually call the police. So the police arrived and they knocked on the door. There was no answer, and that was pretty much that. They did 2 wellness checks and kind of told the neighbors, like, hey, we didn't find anything. There's nothing suspicious. No one answered the door, and basically just based on privacy, we can't just bust down the door. This made the neighbors feel pretty uncomfortable because at this point it's been well over a month since Brian has last been seen, and they know Brian's behaviors. They know that this is not normal behavior for this man and that something might not be right here. So finally, on August 7th, a missing persons case was actually then filed for Brian because his family decided that they haven't heard from him and it was time to file an actual missing persons case. Now, there have been attempts from the police and attempts from Brian's family to call Brian's phone, and every time that they would call, they actually were receiving voice messages, basically claiming to be Brian, saying that he's not home right now, he is on vacation. But right off the bat, his family noticed, they know Brian, they know what he sounds like, and they were like, that's not him on the voicemail. So they were already suspicious at this point. And again, the cops decided to go to the house in August, and they knocked on the door. There was no answer, and that was pretty much that. They again gave them the same excuse as before, that they can't just bust the door open and people have the right to their privacy. Therefore, they're not just going to bombard into their home. Which honestly, I guess I understand where they're coming from, but at the same time, a part of me is just absolutely not. The last time that they saw him was around May or June, and it's now August, and there's still no word from this person, and you're still not going to attempt to go inside, have a search warrant, anything. That just seems a little strange to me. So the whole voicemail thing definitely threw people off, especially his family, because like I mentioned earlier in the video, Brian doesn't have a large source of income at all. In fact, he has no job at the moment. He was eating at homeless shelters a lot. He never went on big extravagant vacations, and he lived a pretty frugal lifestyle. So for him to just go on vacation and then to be on vacation for months at a time seemed very, very, very out of character for him. So although the authorities were saying that there's nothing to be suspicious about, his family, friends, and neighbors were saying quite the opposite about that. So around mid-August, his neighbors got even more suspicious at this time because Scott noticed a very strange vehicle that was parked in front of Brian's house. And this vehicle was actually a private company for a cleaning service. So for the last few days, they noticed people, these 2 men going in and out of the house. They were bringing cleaning supplies in. They were working with the cleaning crew. They were constantly just cleaning for the last few days, which again, red flags. So at this time, Scott was like, you know what, I've had enough. There are these strange men that are still in his house, and now there's a private cleaning company van. This is very, very, very strange. So Scott decided to call the cops again. So when the cops arrived at the scene, there was word Basically, I read that when the cops finally showed up on the scene after getting called again, that at this time there was a strong kind of decay scent that was coming from the house. It was a very strong odor. At this time, this is kind of where in the story, I've read so many different reports, and there are some things that take with a grain of salt and do some research on the case and see what you see, because I had a hard time finding 100% accuracy, I feel. But basically, there were 2 men that were going in and out of the house. I read some reports saying that when the police got there with the cleaning van there, one of the guys who was staying in the house was there with the cleaning people and was arrested then. But then I also read some reports saying that it wasn't until a couple days later that people were finally arrested around the case. So again, kind of take it how you will, but I just thought that I would mention that. Finally, the police get a search warrant, and now it is the middle of August. He's been missing since probably around May, early June, and they are just now entering the home with a search warrant. It took the police 2 days to search the home. On the second day, the cops unfortunately did finally come across a body. Now, this is a little bit gruesome, so if you are squeamish when it comes to descriptions at all, I'm not going to get super detailed or anything, but if you do get squeamish, maybe fast forward a little bit. So yeah, it took the cops 2 days basically to search and find anything. And when they did find it, they said that the body was found in a very like concealed location of the house, whatever that means. So I don't know how hidden, I mean, something could possibly be in the house, but it was. So when they finally found the body, they found him in a fish tank, and inside the fish tank it was filled with chemicals and the body of, at the time, an unknown man, because when they found the body, his head was missing and so were his hands. They couldn't find them anywhere on the scene in the house, so as of now, the head and the hands are still missing. So obviously they weren't able to identify him right away, so when they did the autopsy, they were able to do DNA analysis and come to the conclusion that this was in fact the body of Brian Egg. The autopsy reports showed that he was murdered by blunt force trauma to the body. Around the house and around the fish tank, they found bottles of like Drano and other chemicals that were added into the fish tank, and it was just an absolutely horrific scene. Now, at this point, when they found the body, the neighbors and family were absolutely infuriated, and they full on deserved to be infuriated because they started reporting him missing literally in July, and it wasn't until mid-August to where the cops finally decided to do something and go inside the home. So the men that I mentioned previously, there were 2 men now who were suspects of the crime. The 2 men who were in and out of the house, the men that were claiming to be house sitting while Brian was on vacation. So these 2 men were Robert McCaffrey and Lance Silva. Now, again, this is super bizarre, but I've seen also reports saying Michael Silva, but I don't know how a huge news source got a name wrong. So I don't know if it's Michael Lance Silva or Lance Michael Silva, but most of the stories that I read were Lance Silva. So again, kind of confusing. But these men were finally arrested because they found out that Silva was using Brian Egg's credit card. He actually purchased a used BMW with his credit card and amongst other things, but he was clearly using his card. Both men were arrested on charges of homicide, fraud, theft, identity theft, and elder abuse. So quite the laundry list of things to be arrested for. You'd think that they would have solid evidence, whether it was fingerprints or what, but these charges were actually not formally filed. Basically, McCaffrey was let go. So Silva ended up staying, but this was for probation violations that had to do with a completely different case. So we have one person who was set free, and then another person who was using this man's card, staying in this man's home, claiming, to be house sitting, and he was only kept in jail because of probation violation for something else that he had committed. This outraged the community. This outraged Brian's community, his family, his friends, his neighbors in the area, especially Scott Free. Scott called the cops several times. Scott went on social media apps I think it's the neighborhood apps. He went on those to inform the community that there are basically murderers around the neighborhood who are being let free, and that he strongly believed that there, was zero justice brought to this case, and rightfully so, and he's still fighting to this day. Is very adamant about still informing the media and still talking about how the police work was disturbing in his own words. He talked about how he saw strange behaviors right away when he realized he was missing in May, and that cops just literally didn't seem interested in investigating any further with his disappearance until August 15th, around the middle of August. So yeah, he would use neighborhood apps basically to try to get the community together, to keep fighting for Brian's death, to know, hey, we need to stop crimes from happening in the future. This is something that's going to continue happening if these people aren't brought to justice. San Francisco's district attorney's office basically released a statement saying that at this time they have, no case built up yet to basically close the case, and that these people, may still be suspects at the time, but as of right now, they are free men. And just in April, Silva was released from his probation violation. So now we have 2 people who are literally still roaming the streets and have possibly murdered a man and just gotten away with it. Free Brian's neighbor basically is still telling reports. I know I read an article from just a couple days ago that he still sees McCaffrey, Robert McCaffrey, one of the men who was let go, roaming the neighborhoods, still just walking around the sidewalks, roaming free around the neighborhood. So he's literally hasn't even left. And they have to see him every day knowing and believing that he is the man who killed one of their friends in the neighborhood. I literally can't imagine seeing him on a consistent basis after knowing what he possibly most likely has done. Egg's home was sold, I believe it was back in May what I read, but the estate actually sold the home for over $1 million, which is just crazy to me because he bought that house for $19,000 in the 70s. And his neighbors around the area are still saying that there are still people who are pitching tents in the area of the house, that there are still squatters that are still kind of lingering around the area of the home. It's just very interesting because it seems just like the community that Brian lived in is just not okay with letting this case remain unsolved. They want to know that they're living in a protected area, and they don't feel comfortable knowing that basically the law enforcement just completely let them down when they knew something wasn't right, and to this day it still hasn't been solved. So I did read that Brian's older brother has forgiven the police, even though he expressed his, severe dissatisfaction around the whole case itself. The fact that he, didn't even know he was a missing person around May, and that it's been lingering for so long. But he did actually forgive the police for their crappy police work, to be quite blunt. From what I've read, Scott still hasn't let this go. He's still fighting for justice for Brian Egg. He's still bringing attention to the police work that was on this case. He's still bringing awareness to his neighbors, to the people in the area of San Francisco, letting them know, that there are people who murdered this man and no one has paid the consequences because of it. So unfortunately, that is pretty much where this case wraps up. I know that it was kind of all over the place, but I recommend you reading about it and reading a couple different sources, because like I said, I've read a few things where the information was different. So kind of make what you will if you do your own research outside of this case. But this is such a frustrating case. I can't imagine seeing the people who are the top suspects still lingering around the area as though nothing's happened. I feel so just disgusted by that, honestly. I hope that Scott Free keeps fighting for Brian's justice. I think it's great how much awareness he's bringing to this case by informing people, by informing his neighbors, and talking about the police work that was done in this case. When you live next to somebody for such a long time, you know that person. Whether or not you're super close with them, you understand, when they're, leaving for the day, you understand their patterns, you understand their behaviors, because you observe them, you interact with them in some way, shape, or form. He knew right away that something was wrong. So yeah, that wraps up today's case. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments down below. If you guys have any cases that you would like for me to cover, please let me know in the comment section down below. Thank you guys so much for subscribing to my channel. My channel keeps growing and it does make my day. So if you guys have any video requests, please let me know. Yeah, thank you guys so much for watching my video, and I'll see you guys in my next one.